Hello, everyone. I'm Suyash from Carnegie, India. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar. This is being jointly organized by Carnegie India and the Federation of Indian Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises. I will moderate this discussion along with Mr. Anil Bhardwaj, who is the Secretary General of the Federation. We will have this discussion in three parts. First, I and Mr. Bhardwaj will make some introductory remarks and frame some questions and issues for the speakers. We will then invite the speakers to make their remarks. After all the four speakers have made their remarks, we will take the questions from participants. You can enter your questions on Zoom through the Q&A link you can see below. Or you can also, if you're watching on YouTube, you can send your questions on YouTube as well. Now coming back to the issues for this seminar. Uh, India has been in a lockdown, almost nationwide lockdown for 7 weeks now. And this is obviously having a very big impact across most sectors and firms in the economy. Our focus today is to understand what's happening with MSMEs and what could be done about it. And why are MSMEs important? MSMEs are important because they're a very large part of the Indian economy. There are about 63.4 million of them on latest count. They contribute at over 30% of GDP. They employ about 111 million workers. Uh, Most of these are micro enterprises. So about 63 million out of the 63.4 million are actually micro enterprises, which employ 1 to 2 persons only. And altogether, these micro enterprises employ about 108 million workers. Then there are small enterprises, which are about 330,000 in numbers, and they employ about 10 workers on an average. And then there are about 5,000 medium enterprises, which employ about 30 workers on an average. So that's the lay of the land. And if you look at the sectors of the MSMEs, they're neatly divided into three sectors. About a third of the MSMEs are in manufacturing, about a third are in trading, and a third in other non-trading services sectors. Uh, Interesting thing about MSMEs is that a majority of them are in rural areas. So where, as of now, at least we are seeing that there is a relatively lower risk of transmission, and I hope that sustains. But if you look at only small and medium enterprises, not micro enterprises, then about three-fourths are in urban areas. And urban areas, as you know, are badly hit by this crisis. And although we are seeing a lot of impact on economic activity, we have seen numbers on unemployment, we have seen numbers on industrial production, and so on. The key feature of this crisis as of now is its uncertainty, I think, because even the immediate impact matters a lot. We don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know when we will find a vaccine or a treatment for this disease. We don't know which sectors and firms will be able to get back to work and adapt in a manner that the COVID-19 risk, the virus risk itself, is lower. And also, we don't know what the macroeconomic situation will be 6 months, 1 year down the line. So there is a lot of uncertainty in this crisis, and that uncertainty also seems to be shaping the way in which MSMEs are getting affected. So one aspect of it, this is availability of finance. So MSMEs need to get loans to tide through this crisis, but right at this time, because of uncertainty, many banks and NBFCs are not able to lend to them. Similarly, there is uncertainty about labor availability. So, I mean, experiences are mixed, but many sectors are seeing problems of labor supply because many workers, especially migrant workers, are not, I mean, easily available to do work at this time because of the risk that is posed by the virus. There is also uncertainty around supply chains. So, for example, you've got red, green, and orange zones. If you have a supply chain where some parts of the supply chain are in red zone, then establishments in other zones are also finding it difficult sometimes to start work because part of the supply chain is disrupted. And finally, of course, there is uncertainty around demand for products. Because there is a crisis going on, many consumers may cut back on consumption. Even export demand may suffer because of these kind of crises. Many times during a crisis like this, people cut back on consumption. Uh, so, with this background and keeping in mind the nature of MSMEs, the nature of this crisis, and the uncertainty around it, I would like to pose three issues and questions for the speakers. The first is about if you can talk a little bit about the impact that the crisis is having on MSMEs and how MSMEs are coping with this crisis from your respective vantage points as lenders, e-commerce marketplaces, SME leaders, and of course, as journalists who are looking at the economy broadly. Are there any bright spots? Which sectors are particularly badly hit? So it'll be good to know this impact story a little better. Second is about we are hearing that government is planning a fiscal stimulus. So that's one part of the story. What is the policy response that could help SMEs right now? So one part of it is getting some economic activity started and going could also help because it will reduce the impact. The other part is fiscal and other support that government could extend to MSMEs. And how can we do this in a way that is effective and both efficient? Because as you know, in India, we have a constraint on fiscal resources. It's not easy for government to mobilize resources, and whatever resources are put up should be used well. So it's important to understand what could work well. And the third issue that I would like the speakers to talk about a little bit is more speculative. That if you were to see a year or two down the line, and hoping that some of this uncertainty recedes and we have a better clarity, what do you see in the post-COVID world for MSME? So, in what way will that world change? So, those are my remarks, and those are the issues that I would like the speakers to consider speaking on. I will now invite Mr. Anil Bhardwaj to make his introductory remarks as a co-moderator.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Suyash, for this opportunity. Let me first welcome the panelists and the audience also who have joined us today. Let me begin first by sharing that what is the current status in the MSME sector. See, vast majority of MSMEs are under lockdown. Although allowed to open in rural areas, but local administration would rather have them closed. There is not much clarity that what should be allowed to be opened, and typically the local administration is of the view that it's better that it stays closed. Even in industrial clusters like Noida, people are running from pillar to post for getting permission to open. I have hundreds of such examples, and it's very painful also. Then ecosystem is dysfunctional, as you know, the supply, the major markets, the supply chains, even the transport was not functional. And so majority of MSMEs remain closed or nearly closed. Opening up or restart is in a very nascent stage at this moment. But fixed expenses continue. So is the meter of interest charges and the salaries and so on and so forth. So majority stares at tough times and is anxious about future. And this anxiety stems from the extreme views that are there about future. So when we think of scenarios, so we have scenarios ranging from the V-shaped recovery of hopefuls to doomsday sayers. MSMEs are pragmatic, hard-nosed businessmen, but need practical advice based on facts. The common sense analysis would naturally suggest that sectors like tours and travel, services requiring personal contact, fast food and restaurants, and supply chain associated with them would definitely get affected very quickly and may take time to recover. But they shall need more nuanced advice on scaling down or scaling up. Investment decisions, moving in or out of India. There is talk of already transformation in global value chains, that many of them based in China would be in lookout for better countries to shift their manufacturing bases. How India fares vis-a-vis competing nations, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Bangladesh, where such opportunities are likely to come up, which sectors, what can be done to attract them in India, and if reforms are required, in which areas, what kind of reforms. These are some of the questions that are staring us immediately beyond the COVID lockdown. So with this, I would invite one more thing, but there is an equal interest in the macro economy as well, because of its impact on interest rates, liquidity, and purchasing power. So I'd rather request our panelists to also shed some light on these emerging trends. Now, let me invite Mr. T. K. Arun, the consulting editor of Economic Times. I consider him as a contrarian, for he has a knack of spotting unpopular but incisive insights from these trends. So, T. K. Arunji, please.
Yeah, thank you. Now, we have outlined the major issues that the sector and the economy in general confront. But there are some things which can be done which somehow are not being done. For example, today we see a steady stream of new testing techniques and kits being developed by startups, academic bodies, research institutes across the country. Now, some of them offer a definitive test for the presence of the virus, not the antibody, for less than 1,000 rupees. Now, these kind of things are to be certified, approved, and put in the market as soon as possible. Because when the economy opens up and people need to work, it is important to identify people who are free of the virus and those who are not. So, if people can be quickly determined as being free of the virus in a matter of 2 hours through a test, then such people can actually, work together without too much of a bother. They can travel in a plane without infecting other people. They might be able to stay in a workplace and work. It might be necessary to rearrange work in such a fashion that for a fortnight, one shift of workers work more or less continuously. But they can work at full capacity, not really bothering about social distancing, provided you have tests that can effectively and positively determine them as being virus free. So these kind of things need to be done. Second, the economy needs to be divided not into red, green, and orange zones, into hotspots, which need to be contained, which could be a building, it could be a cluster of buildings that will allow a perimeter to be defined and access control, and the rest. So, barring in these clusters where the infection could spread, the economy should be opened up completely outside these clusters. And so this problem of, your supplier being in a red zone and you are having to work in a green zone and opening up, not being able to find your inputs, will disappear. The red zone, it doesn't really matter. If there's an infection spread, of course, it is closed. But the rest should be allowed to function. So these are some commonsensical issues which I don't know why we don't really seem to come to grips with fast enough. Now, I'm not really a big pessimist on what will happen to the economy afterwards. Now, India is a country that runs a current account deficit, which means we do rely upon the rest of the world to provide us inputs for our growth. But we don't depend upon net exports to drive our economic growth. We are driven by our internal market. So if the internal market can be turned dynamic, can be sufficiently strong and robust, then it is possible for us to drive growth. Now the question is, can this be done? And how can it be done? I think we need to look at two things. One, global capital is available relatively cheap. In the wake of the global financial crisis, some 14 to 17 trillion dollars worth of liquidity was created by the central banks in the US, Japan, Europe, and England. Now, all this liquidity, some of it was sucked back during the course of the post-crisis recovery, but much of it still remains, which is why asset prices are way above what they ought to be purely on the basis of fundamentals. In the wake of this COVID crisis, again, these central banks are resorting to monetary easing, which means they are creating quantitative easing and creating excess liquidity. So this liquidity is available. Savers who are confronted with negative to very marginal rates of interest in the developed world seek positive returns somewhere. If our government can provide a guarantee that you will get at least 1% return, risk free of other risks, they'll be happy to invest in this country. So to worry about the source of capital, to my mind, is meaningless. The world is awash with liquidity, looking for profitable deployment. The task is to give a guarantee that this money is safe and you will get the return. Now, this cannot happen through conventional market means of a pension fund or a sovereign wealth fund investing directly in the equity markets of this country, or investing in the equity of companies. They will have to be counter guaranteed by government by investing in a large special purpose vehicle set up by the government. And on that, the government guarantees a return. Then it will be the job of this special purpose vehicle to channel the funds into the Indian economy. Now, very simple fact. We are right now around 33-34% urban and 66% rural. No fast-growing economy anywhere in the world has remained as rural as India has been. If India is to become a prosperous nation, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, we will urbanize, we will become 50% urban. If India becomes 50% urban, that means more than 20, 25 crore people moving from village to town, depending upon what the time period you're looking at. 25 crore people cannot move into the existing towns. We need to, I did this back of the numbers, with a density of 12,000 people per square kilometer, which is a fairly high density. You will need 20,000 square kilometers of additional urban space. 20,000 square kilometers of additional urban space. That is some 16 Delhis additional. Suppose you build one city now. You build one city. The demand for this one city, for in terms of cement, concrete, wood, furniture, all the things that make up a city, will be so huge. It can drive growth, independent of what happens in the rest of the world. The rest of the world will actually serve as a supplier of relatively cheap energy, relatively cheap commodities, relatively cheap technology for you to feed your growth by creating this new hubs of growth in this country called cities. There are other things that can do. Healthcare infrastructure. We are completely deficient in healthcare. So we need to think of a system in which healthcare is sufficiently large to cater to the next pandemic. So what is the problem that we are shut down today? Why is it that we don't shut down? Because there is tuberculosis in the system, or there is cholera in the system, or there is some other disease in the system? Because we know we can tackle this. We can treat these people who are affected, who are the patients. In this case, we don't have the capacity. If 10% of the population gets infected, let's hope it doesn't happen, then, and even a small proportion, say 5% require admission to an intensive care unit, you require a large number of intensive care unit beds, probably say 1 million intensive care unit beds. If you have 1 million ICU beds in this country, you can keep your economy open, whatever the pandemic. You just need to treat the people who can fall ill. And then the population will develop herd immunity, and you'll be able to keep on functioning as an economy. Now, this is like building up the capacity to meet peak demand in the power sector. The difference between the peak demand in power and base load can be as high as 40 to 50%. But you still build the capacity to meet the peak demand. And so the installed capacity is much higher than actual utilized capacity. Similarly, it might be the case in the health sector that you build excess capacity and you hold it in reserve. In case the demand kicks in, you will provide. You need to build that capacity. It will require investment in training, in personnel, in systems, in data management, so many things. All of which will again drive growth, create demand for value from across the chain, big companies, small companies, medium companies, micro companies. So to my mind, if there is boldness in vision and the ability to think outside the box, it is possible to drive growth in India and generate demand, which will take care of one major problem that the SMEs will face when they come out of this. Who are we producing for? Where is the demand? Then comes the very important issue, where is the finance that the SMEs are going to get? I think the easiest step for the government is to use its extra leverage it has with large companies today to force them, every single one of them, to come onto the TREDS platform, the Trade Receivables Electronic Discounting System. Why should a small supplier be forced to forego receipts for the supply it makes for 5 months, 6 months? They should be able to get the money immediately from some bank or non-banking finance company who is part of the TREDS platform. But if the large buyer to whom they supply goods and on whom they raise an invoice is part of this system, and the factoring actually happens. If this happens immediately, one major hurdle that small industries face will be overcome. Second, the government has already some schemes in place for credit guarantee and interest rate subsidy. These should be expanded, and much larger subventions be made from the budget to offer credit guarantee and interest rate subvention to as many companies as possible. Third, there is this question of equity. Right now, SMEs, if they get a loan from any bank, even at a fairly moderate rate of interest, when they haven't been generating any revenue for 6-7 weeks and might generate only a fraction of their potential revenue for the next 6-7 months, how are they going to service this loan? So what they essentially need is money which doesn't need to be serviced immediately. This could be an interest-free loan, or this could be equity. So companies which are willing to take equity from a supplier of equity should be willing to take that equity and cede some control to the provider of the equity. But if they do that, there are very many benefits. Through a widely distributed array of investment vehicles, which could be linked to the banks that deal with NBFCs, that deal with small and medium enterprises, through NBFCs that deal with these things, through an array of SIBIs, venture funds, and similar venture funds outside, it will be possible to push capital as equity into a large number of companies. And this equity should be welcome. Around 1 crore companies are now registered under GST. So these are potentially part of the formal sector. And they should be more than happy to have their accounts fully formalized and be in a position to receive injection of equity. I think that will be another thing that can be done to supply capital, which these companies badly need right now, to take them forward. Then there is an issue of manpower. A great many of these people who are migrant workers who have now gone back home might not be in a position to return immediately, or might not want to return immediately. Now, India doesn't have a formal social security system except very meager, nominal kind of a thing. The only real social security system we have is unemployment in the vast agricultural hinterland, where you will be able to eke out a living, might be at subsistence level. Your kin and your family, somebody will supply you with some food, you will not starve. So unless people are assured of being taken care of in case of another pandemic or a kind of extreme stress, they would not like to come to a city and suffer the same kind of risk and the mistreatment they were subjected to in the recent past. So if this happens, there will be a greater shift to substitution of capital for labor. On assembly lines, you would have greater present deployment of cobots, co-working robots, and such other things. You never know. And you, on the other hand, you will have a greater supply of people in the rural area who are used to working on machines, who are used to the discipline of a factory life, and who in turn can potentially become the manpower for a rural value added in agriculture kind of industries. India today is at the cusp of a revolutionary change. For the first time, we have power supply, at least the lines have been drawn, and the generation capacity exists to supply power to rural areas during the daytime. If you have power supply in the daytime in a rural area, you can actually have a food processing industry coming up. And some of these people will, become the manpower or become the entrepreneurs who drive these kind of industry. So, which brings us to the power sector. No industry can function properly, efficiently, competitively if they are forced to run on a diesel genset half the time. We have destroyed our power sector with our political culture, which says, power is for free for the farmer. Power is for free for this category. If you steal power, I'll close my eyes. We have conditioned our consumers not to pay for the power we consume. The other day at a seminar, somebody said the total bill power is 7 lakh crore. Out of that, 2 lakh crore is not paid for, which means around 30% is not paid for the bill power. Now, even before billing, there's a large amount of power which is not billed at all. The transmission loss and the so-called distribution loss is not billed. Now, the distribution loss includes theft. It includes unmetered power given to farmers. Now, so the substantial portion of the power that is generated in this country is not paid for. Therefore, naturally, the system is broke. Utilities cannot pay for the power they purchase from generators, and the purchase generators find it difficult to keep supplying power to the utilities. And so you have less than 50% capacity utilization of the more than 350,000 megawatt of power generation capacity you have built up. This is the ridiculous situation we find ourselves in. This calls for political resolve. The government must say, unless you pay for the power you consume, our system will collapse, and therefore please pay. And we will not tolerate any theft. We will not tolerate giveaways. If a state government wants to give its farmers power for free, please, you are welcome to, but please provide it for in the budget. So you'll have to take care of the power sector if you want the SMEs or even larger industry to function properly. Now, the systems that work allow a small company to operate are not entirely in the hands of the central government. A vast majority of support things are done by the state government. The state governments are financially bankrupt and unable to deliver service, then of course your system will collapse. So there must be a provision for funding the state governments and giving them their GST dues, allowing them to make up for their shortfall in revenues and GST. All these things must be again done by the center. Again, it will have to resort to borrowing. Now, so suppose say Dr. C. Rangarajan estimates, for example, the total borrowing requirement in the economy around say 13.5% of GDP. Now, this a lot of the money will have to come from abroad, and some of it will have to come from the RBI. The central bank in India will have to shed its inhibitions and monetize the deficit. There is no escape. It will have to pick up the bonds issued by state governments and central government. Okay, the money will be created, but right now our worry is not inflation. Our worry is not excess demand. Our worry is absence of demand. While there might be a short-term bump up in inflation because of supply constraints that we have created because the poor production, we have cut short supplies of vegetables, we have interrupted movement in goods across state borders. So supply has stopped in a great many things which are even allowed today. So if you overcome these can be done. Finally, this distinction between essentials and non-essentials must just go. The vast majority of our industry produce things which are in the government's classification non-essential. So if you maintain that kind of a distinction, industry will not be able to produce anything. The people who sell these things will not be able to sell what they have to sell, and there will be no demand for them to open their shops and open their factories and function at all. So this kind of categorization must go, and everything must be allowed to be produced, transported, and sold. And for this, you need greater coordination between the various different levels of the government. The central government, what it says must be clearly implemented by the state government, and what the state government wants to implement must be clear to the district magistrate, and what the district magistrate says must be fully understood and enforced by the police agencies. Unless this transmission happens clearly and effectively, again you will have the system getting stuck. So a lot of the things that we require are matters of political will and political vision. A lot of it is financing, but I don't see any reason why we cannot do all these things that I have outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. Suyashji, kindly take over from here.
May I now ask Rajneesh to speak? Rajneesh Kumar is the Chief Corporate Affairs Officer of Flipkart, and I thought he has an interesting ringside view of what is happening to some of the SMEs who are sellers on the e-commerce platform. And so if you can talk a little bit about what are the segments that are operating and what are the segments that could start operating soon. What is the impact that is happening on the sellers as of now, and how could the e-commerce marketplaces help some of them get back to business soon? And what do you see happening in the medium term as far as the e-commerce marketplaces are concerned and their impact of MSMEs?
Afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting me, Mr. Rai. Mr. Bhardwaj and Mr. Arun they have already sort of talked at length about the challenges that MSMEs are facing and some of the other macro issues. Just to sort of let you know that, e-commerce in India is a marketplace business, and marketplace means, it has a lot of thousands and lakhs of MSMEs. Most of them are MSMEs, small sellers, coming on the platform. And as a technology platform, we bring insights from what consumers want at what price, and we bring those insights back to these MSMEs so that they can produce and manufacture and make sure that they are able to sell these products on the platform. Now, so as an important component of a marketplace e-commerce, it's now when you look at, say, for example, MHA advisory, what they really talk about is that they, for example, at this point of time, it exists between green, orange, and red zones. While they have allowed green and orange zones to be serviced through non-essential as well. But what they have not done, what the advisory has not done is, they have not made it very clear what is on the operation side of it. For example, a lot of these sellers, a lot of these MSMEs, and I know Mr. Bhardwaj already alluded to that, are actually in the red zones. Now, if you don't very explicitly define whether these people are allowed to operate or not, whether the sellers is able to have these employees come to the warehouses, you basically make them, they become completely dysfunctional. So that's where the challenge is. The MSMEs can only be successful if there is a totality of supply chain construct is kept in mind in terms of, so when you are able to, look at supply chain in a total context, then only these people are able to operate. So today, most of them, most of the sellers, are not able to operate and they're seeking guidelines from the local authorities. But I don't think there is a clarity that exists today. So only sellers which are available in green and orange zone are able to operate the warehouses and sort of furnish. Now, having said that, a lot of the demand clusters are actually present. For example, in today's environment where people are working from home, a lot of these demand clusters are actually in red zone. Mumbai, Delhi, Gurgaon, Pune, you name it. And most of these places are actually in red zone. Now, while government has allowed shops to open up, typically as an e-commerce industry, which can actually significantly support social distancing and make sure that they can balance the twin aspects of social distancing plus some sort of economic revival. We can only sell essentials, so to say. Now, when I talk to a lot of these consumer organizations, one of the things that they mentioned, the same thing which Mr. Arun mentioned. Today, people are actually buying only what they really need. So for them, if somebody's fridge is not working today and he or she needs to sort of keep products out there, it's actually as essential as food for me. So I think that differentiation definitely needs to be blurred, and there has been efforts by the government. I should make sure that we give credit where it is due, especially on the supply chain movement perspective. They have actually very early on, they allowed all the goods to move, because the first week was really bad. Supply chain was completely sort of gone awry. Nothing was able to move in the supply chain, but at least that thing changed. But having said that, I think that struggle still remains at this point of time. We are only seeing MSMEs, while there is a lot of willingness for them. For example, I'll give you a very interesting example. One of the fashion MSMEs, and fashion is one of the biggest, for example, for us at Flipkart, fashion is one of the biggest category in which consumers operate and buy. So the guy, the small MSME employs around 50 people, said that we will be happy to sort of start it and start making masks, for example. They were making something else, but they said that we will be happy to start producing masks, but at least it will allow me to sort of make sure that the employees that are employed in my organization, I will be able to pay them well. So the very survival of a lot of these MSMEs is at stake at this point of time. And while they will require economic package, but I think key would be for all of us to start looking at supply chain in the overall context and see that how do we enable it? How do we use technology to make sure that the MSMEs have a right awareness of what is in demand? Consumption, for example, domestic consumption, as Mr. Arun mentioned, is the one which will actually continue to drive the growth in India. And I think there's an enormous opportunity for us to do that. As government opened up green and orange zones, we realized that there has been a pent-up demand. There has been an ask for consumers. Maybe they're asking different things, but there is an opportunity for us as a player in e-commerce to make sure that we are able to bring those insights back to the MSMEs and tell them that, listen, you need to start producing these things now, because this is what is in demand at this point of time. And that opportunity exists enormously. And and again, I think one of the last point which I will mention is in addition to make sure that a lot of these insights are available to our MSMEs from a consumer perspective. I think there's a lot of effort which e-commerce industry and we ourselves have done to make sure that a lot of these MSMEs are survive. We have a very program especially designed to enable MSMEs to operate online. We make sure that they have a right availability at a comparative interest rates. They have funds available. Including the insurance and all those pieces. So I think from our side, we make a lot of efforts to ensure that MSMEs have access to right support system to operate. And if the government provides an enabling environment for them to access the supply chain, access the consumers that they can service, I see no doubt why the opportunity ahead of us, we will not be able to support them. Of course, consumer sentiments could be softened in the short term because all of us face an uncertain future, at least from a near to mid-term. But an intrinsic demand, because Indian consumption needs to definitely grow up several times, several fold. So there's an enormous opportunity that exists even now to make sure that we tap that demand, make sure they have right support system available, right insights available, right platforms available. But I see no doubt in next 3 to 6 months, for example, there will be consumers would want to look at online mechanism to sort of shop. Now, if that's the proposition that MSMEs have, rather than focusing on a very small market that they may be serving right now, e-commerce actually takes them to across the country. So suddenly the opportunity for MSME that they can sort of leverage using digital tools seems very enormous to me. And if we tap this opportunity well as an ecosystem together, as a nation together, I see no reason why we will not be able to support MSMEs and actually help them contribute further to the Indian GDP, contribute more jobs. So yes, that's I'm happy to take the questions as we go forward, but this is a sort of a smaller intervention from my side.
Could I ask Rajneesh a question?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
please.
Would a company like Walmart or a major brand like Nike or Zara want to invest in a locality where there are no labor norms? How will this go down with your consumers? People who supply you capital, will they welcome the absence of labor norms, or will they think that this is a place we should avoid?
See, as a global organization, we sort of follow certain norms irrespective of, we have standards which we ensure that, we sort of follow up. And those large governance norms help us thrive in every market that we operate. As a company, if I talk about our parent company, that operates in 28, 29 countries with different sort of laws everywhere. I think adaptability to the local laws, making sure that we follow fundamentally a value system of respecting individual, making sure that we contribute to our employees irrespective of which level they are in. I think those are the basic fundamental tenets of operation for us. And we deal with all those laws irrespective in many, several countries, and all of them are very different laws. So while ensuring that we follow all the laws, I think ultimately it's important to look at the market context and see how we match what consumers are asking, how we make sure that we treat our people well, because ultimately as an organization, across not just across the country but globally, we will only be able to attract people to work for us if we respect them and make sure that they are sort of treated very well and compensated very well. Does this answer your question, or is there a specific aspect that you want me to address?
No, that's fine.
Suyash, can I come in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so now I take this opportunity to invite Mr. V.K. Agarwal, a successful entrepreneur based in Lucknow and also former president of FISME. He's deeply involved in economic policy discourse in the MSME space and viewed more an economic thinker than an entrepreneur, though he's a successful entrepreneur also. So, Shri V.K. Agarwal ji, please.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you, panelists and the audience. Am I audible?
Yes, please go
Am I
ahead.
audible? Okay. So, like Anil introduced me as an entrepreneur, it's a fact that I am an entrepreneur, and because I am an entrepreneur, I have a lot of pain out of this unprecedented pandemic, anguish at what could have been done and has not been done, and suspicious about what future holds for us. Not as optimistic as some of us are. It's good to be optimistic. Even I call my government to be very optimistic. But finally, even the government has started admitting that we may have to live with this virus for a very, very long time. So, which means that the virus will continue and the economic activity should continue. There will be certain restrictions because of this new ways will have to be devised, but if virus doesn't go, we can't wait for the virus to go away to start the economic activities, because the keeping the economy closed is very, very scary. And it's very scary for those who are at the bottom end of this stair. They are in real mess. And I would say that there are figures about MSME, very large figures, some 6.4 crores MSMEs are there. And because that number represents whole homogeneous components, and I suppose very, very large number out of that 6.4 is, I would call sub-micro. They are not even micro, but sub-micro. So MSME sector, or large part of it, is hurt like migrant labor and daily wages. Now, the topic is pathways to normalcy. So I suppose new normal post-COVID will be different from the present, I think, for all businesses. Although the variance will vary widely from sector to sector. I believe the demand contraction will be from 20 to 80% in different businesses. And I can think of very few businesses which will have growth potential because of or after COVID. Maybe ICT is one. Communication might be a bright spot. I see intense competition growing after COVID, because the demand is going to go down, and the capacities, even the existing capacities without further expansion, will put such a pressure on the prices that the value additions will come down. For my entrepreneur friends, I think that the first post-COVID step they should take, or rather they should start it right away, even before the COVID is over, is to reassess their numbers, the numbers of their industries in which they are operating and of their enterprises individually. You will have to develop a new business plan for yourself. Based on your assumptions, you will have to reduce expenses drastically under different heads. And the first target has to be of fixed expenses. And within fixed expenses, I fear that one of the first will be the employment expenses. We'll have to reduce the number of people working with us, because it would not be viable to carry on the same number of people with reduced businesses. Of course, There would be another important expenditure which one will have to cut down is interest, and reducing that would mean managing your current expenses or current assets very carefully. Not having excess inventory, not having many resources, trying to work on cash. These will be some ways in which one will be able to reduce his interest expenses, which are generally very substantial part of a business. And I suppose, I presume that the owners of every enterprise, big or small, will have to show some leadership traits by first cutting down his personal expenditure. Because I suppose that will be moral boosting for those whom you would like to be frugal and thrifty. I believe scales will come down. We have always been talking of scale, especially with relation to China. Scale, scale, we keep on hearing about scale. I think scale, we'll have to find a business model which is not so linked to scale. I don't know, really, I'm not clear. But scale, people will have to forget. For example, you have 3D printers. One of the attributes is that it does not require, its operation or its viability does not require scale. So some sort of innovative measures, both in manufacturing and trading, will have to be explored so that we can achieve viability with low volumes. The crux is we have to achieve viability with low volumes. We all, at least I believe that cross-border trade will drop like a bomb for two reasons. Demand all over the world is going to come down, and governments will become increasingly protectionists. And they are becoming protectionists in normal times. There will be valid reasons for them to become protectionists in times to come, because they'll want the economic activities to concentrate within their countries in the interest of their own citizens. Well, employment or the manpower shortage is an interesting dichotomy. On one hand, everyone feels, at least on the ground, that migrants and there's going to be a huge challenge to get back people to work for us. On the other hand, I was uh, listening to some talk by someone which said that something like 200 crores of people are likely to be without job world over. And he somehow estimated something like 10 crores or more to be out of job in India. Well, the two sides, how much time they will take to balance each other, I don't know. There'll be an issue of skills also. Labor may be available, it may not be skilled, and things like that. And even if they are available, they may not be available at a place where they are required. So in this new normal or new scheme of things, we'll have to learn, practice, and absorb the new activities, or I should say the new ways of executing activities. I also find a more sense or more role for industry associations. They will have a lot of constructive jobs to do. For example, I think working together and performing some of the regulatory activities amongst the entrepreneurs, say within a particular industrial estate, would make a lot of economic sense. So associations will be able to, coordinate them. Will also be able to provide them advisory, be it on hygienic matters, be it on meeting some regulations, etc. Uh, Now, I also have an observation that this concept or obsession with GDP numbers may evaporate, and it may be substituted with a balanced life. And people all around are saying that personal consumption is bound to go down, will reduce greatly. And I think even the habits may change. I was talking to somebody in the US who said that, who, who sort of contradicted me by saying that when the meltdown happened in 2008, people went back to their earlier habits by about 2012. Well, perhaps he's right. But then somebody else told me that China and India were acting as engines of growth at that time. Now, these two countries will be missing as engines of growth now. So the situation is uh, more bleak than of that period. I only wish, and if I may say pray, that the crisis stirs up the conscience and creates a sense of urgency at a national scale about basic reforms. And when I say basic reforms, you know, there's so many things which are irrational or practiced in an irrational way. And to my mind, any irrational thought, any irrational practice is a contradiction in itself. So if we can create reforms which make sense, which are logical, then we can move ahead. And the other thing is that I wish that we have a campaign of promoting quality in the country after COVID, because as I said, if the volumes are going to go down, it is necessary for you to increase your value addition per unit. If you want to do that, I think you cannot without quality. Because right now, I suppose we are one of the worst when it comes to quality. Wherever in case of export, wherever we supply, we may supply once or twice or three times, and then we get blacklisted. So, and it has percolated right down to our public sector units, which are very, very large in number, volume in number. So that culture has shifted there, and their culture is now shifting back to the private sector. So it has put the whole country in a mess, if I say so. So I think those who, at enterprise level, those who subscribe to this view will, to my mind, reap immense benefit, and they will earn a differentiator for themselves. So this is what I wanted to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Agarwal. I now invite Bindu Ananth to speak. Bindu is the chair of Dwara Trust, and Dwara Trust promotes a number of organizations that provide financial and non-financial services to households and enterprises, especially in rural areas. And Bindu, if we could talk about two things. One, I mean, you have about, through different companies, you have about 1.2 million clients, as you're telling me. What is happening to the financial lives of those clients, especially those who run micro enterprises? And also, again, from the financial sector point of view, we are seeing this kind of situation where there is a lot of liquidity in the system, but lending has come to a standstill. And I suppose that's also true of lending to MSMEs. Are there ways to break this logjam that we are seeing in the system?
Sure. Thank you, Suyash. Thank you, Mr. Bhardwaj. I think one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is that even before the current COVID crisis, there was actually a reasonable level of anxiety about the state of MSMEs. In fact, I was part of a committee chaired by Mr. UK Sinha. This was an RBI committee middle of last year. And already at that point, there was concern about, there's been just several body blows to the sector, GST rollout, demon, declining exports. So I think, 8 months ago, we were worried. And so I think this is a very, very difficult situation. I think it's helpful to grapple with the scale of the problem. And as some of the other speakers said, probably use this opportunity to roll out measures that were always necessary, but for a number of reasons, we didn't do anything about it. For example, I think for a good 3-4 years now, we've been quibbling about shouldn't we change the definition for MSMEs in India. Most countries classify MSMEs based on some combination of turnover and employment. We continue with the somewhat older thinking around scale of initial investment. which is a little bit of a manufacturing bias in our thinking. Whereas, as Suyash pointed out, more than 35% is actually now services and trade. So there are we have a long list, I think, of reforms that we would all agree need to be done as of yesterday. So my only hope is that one silver lining is that this current crisis gives us some urgency and political will to do all of that. Coming to the state of MSMEs, what I see, really kind of echo that there is significant hardship, mostly because of the impacts of the lockdown itself. I think the early MSMEs that found themselves in a spot were ones with supply chain links to China. So on the supply side had dependency. And of course, post the lockdown, everybody's sort of facing the whole demand evaporation. And I think even as things recover, there will be a lot of variation in terms of regions, geographies, also capital intensity. I think many speakers brought up the point about fixed costs. I think fixed costs are much more of a killer for entities that have a high degree of capital investment, and therefore perhaps services sector can rebound as soon as there is reasonable demand. But there will be mortality of firms for sure coming out of the crisis, and that's just something to think about and plan for. Suyash, I have a couple of slides that I'll just quickly run through, and then I want to talk about a specific financing idea to your question around what can be done. So I think the first point we already talked about, I'm going to skip this, but MSMEs in India, as everybody has already said, very mixed bag of firms, wide variation in terms of size, investment, profitability, all of that. There are maybe 300,000, 400,000 firms of what we would think of as meaningful size. The other issue we have in India, which again the UK Sena committee flagged, was that we don't have any unique identifier for firms. And the committee recommended that maybe PAN should be repurposed as an enterprise identifier. One of the downsides of not having an identifier is that in a time like this, if we wanted to do very directed relief and support to a certain category of MSMEs, frankly, we just don't know how to do it. In the US, many of you may be tracking that the payroll protection program, for instance, is a loan that converts into a grant if MSMEs commit to maintaining their payroll and employment number at the same level as pre-crisis. And people have been asking for that in India, but really the question is, how are you ever going to verify what the employment levels are within the SME? So I think there's a real issue, and this is something that I would flag for as an important reform point to be taken, so that the next crisis we find ourselves in a better place to identify some of these firms. Let me put this full screen. Quickly on the financing side, just a quick landscape before I talk about the specifics of my proposal. Overall, we're talking about a 15 lakh crore type credit outstanding to the MSME sector. Again, with the caveat that this is all very, very mixed bag. But 90% of this formal market is still banks. NBFCs are 10%, which is $1.5 lakh crore, so not a small amount in absolute terms. And they've been growing in relevance. And NBFCs tend to particularly serve the lower end, so the unsecured, micro, sub-micro type firms that usually don't have any collateral, they don't have any registration, no tax records. So both of these segments are important to make sure that they run on full steam. The other thing I want to kind of call your attention to is on the risk. So if you look at the chart below, apologies if it's too small, but I'll give you the gist of it. Lending to MSMEs is not for the faint-hearted, as I think several bankers will tell you. Expected losses, which is nothing to do with catastrophes or crisis, but on a normal basis, losses lending to MSMEs range from anywhere between 5% at the most tightly managed, most efficient lender, all the way to about 20%. Still better than lending to corporate, mid-size and large corporates. But credit losses are fairly high in the business. And some of it, I think it's a reminder that this is not like, for example, personal loans or gold loans or microfinance, where, the table stakes are 99% recovery. You are lending to businesses, there is failure. Add to that the fact that often lenders don't quite know how to underwrite, how to originate. So even in normal times, this is sort of a risky endeavor. And I think if you look at the measures that have been announced, it's a little bit, in some sense, pouring water into a leaky bucket, in the sense of RBI had, through SIDBI and others, has said, okay, banks, lend more. So everybody's been asked to increase working capital lines by another 10% to existing customers. So, just a 10% increase, we're again talking about a 1 lakh crore plus number. NBFCs have been surprisingly left out of many of these conversations. NBFCs themselves find their own liquidity in a bind because they have to repay their banks. They don't raise deposits, and so their own liquidity is a problem to be solved before they can solve it for their customers. So the bottom line here is that I don't think you're solving for the right problem. As Suyash alluded, liquidity is not quite the problem. I think all banks, particularly public sector banks, are flush with funds. There's been there was life before COVID, Yes Bank, etc. happened. So there's been a flight of deposits anyway. There's certainly no shortage of cash. The real issue is risk aversion. And frankly, if you were a lender, you would feel the same way. This is a highly uncertain atmosphere. Who knows when things come back? There's so many flip-flops in policy, very, very difficult time, right? So it's not just about, lend more or mandating, but we really need to break this whole logjam of risk aversion that, I'm scared to commit any additional capital. I'm just going to sit tight and wait this out, which is what banks are likely to do. We have to break that logjam, I think, in clever ways. At the same time, I spoke to some bankers in ICICI, SBI, and their ask was very simple: give me 100% guarantee on all additional lending, which is a rational and predictable ask from banks. But we know that that would be a terrible idea as well, because we do need banks to exercise their intelligence and think about, okay, which sector. Many speakers talked about the fact that there will be asymmetric impacts. Some sectors will bounce back sooner than others. Some geographies are in a better position. So you don't want to say, I give you 100% guarantee and you are flying blind and lending to anybody who is asking you to, because your fees are guaranteed on that. So we need to make sure that it breaks the risk aversion. At the same time, there is skin in the game for bankers, so that they're thinking through that credit decision. So my proposal is fairly straightforward, to say, let's do a very generous guarantee. And the guarantee mechanism that I propose is a first loss default guarantee, which simply means that, if I lend 100 rupees as a bank, for the first 40 rupees of losses, all of that is borne by the government through the guarantee program. From the 41st rupee onwards, the loss is mine. This is in contrast to, for example, what one might think of as partial guarantee programs, to say for every rupee that you lose, we will share 50-50. But I think given the current environment, even a very generous partial guarantee is not going to be enough, because people are fearing the worst. And of course, the why 40%, it's a little bit ad hoc, but the thought process is that it needs to be enough. And so, like we saw earlier, even in good times, you can have losses of 15% on a reasonable book. Highest end, let's say, kind of a mediocre lender has about 20% of losses. Let's double that number and say that, you need enough buffer given the ongoing crisis, plus the baseline characteristics of MSMEs, to make sure that the lender is well protected. Hence 40%. That's really just a crude estimation of what would be considered generous, and a reasonable number between 0 and 100. I think the other thing to think about is that an FLDG or first loss guarantee is an interesting mechanism because it's not necessarily a direct hit on the fiscal. It's a contingent liability, which is to say, if you lend, let's say 5 lakh crores, knowing that your neck is also on the line, you have some skin in the game as well. And if indeed on that 5 lakh crores, all 40% of losses manifest, then and only then will government have to pay up. So it's in that sense a contingent liability, but it may serve the purpose of getting banks off the kind of starting kind of block to say, how do we get lending to resume? So this is, in any case, one specific thought, but I wanted to touch upon a few other ideas quickly that other speakers brought up. Again, in the spirit of how do we use this crisis to jumpstart reforms, I think TREDS is a very, very important platform that's been created with a lot of limitations. If you look at the amount of volume of transactions on TREDS is very, very low. I think something like 10,000 or some multiple of that crores relative to the total financing, very small. And one of the issues there has been that one, it's restricted, so only banks can participate. We really need to open it up to say anybody who wants to participate, including fintech companies, NBFCs, the more the merrier, right? You want liquidity on these platforms. It should not be a select club. The other thing is that the way currently the platform is structured, the buyer, i.e. the corporate, has to accept the invoice before it can be listed on the platform. And so that essentially the credit risk that the lender is taking is that of the corporate. So let's say, Godrej as a highly rated corporate, it becomes risk that the lender is taking on Godrej and not on a small supplier to Godrej, which may be too high a bar. And so what we've recommended again in Sinha's committee report is to say, open it up, keep that as one window, open another window in TREDS to say, let MSMEs just, kind of post their invoices. They may or may not be accepted, but they may be lenders with risk appetite and who are willing to look at past history, transactions, to actually take a credit call. There is no need to make this a AA risk profile. It can be lower rated, but open up TREDS, A, to more lenders, and B, for it to be not just, what is currently a kind of reverse factoring, but also permit SMEs to post even invoices that have not been accepted. I think a couple of other, this may seem kind of long shot at this point, but some of the challenges we have is just that, why don't we have any bank in the country that sort of has a business strategy focused on MSME financing and therefore is equipped to do good products and not just lending under mandate. And if you look at other countries, for example, Indonesia has a fantastic bank called Bank Danamon, and their only business segment is MSME, and that's large enough, right? If you had a market that was 15 lakh crores, you would imagine that at least a few banks can, prosper on that. But yet in India, we don't see that at all. And I think if you look at some of the distortions, why this is so, for example, priority sector lending still has a very heavy agriculture bias. So if, for example, I apply for a banking license because I'm very smart at MSME lending, but RBI will still require me to do about 20% of lending to agriculture. But if I'm an urban lender, I have no idea about agriculture. How am I supposed to do that? So a lot of our regulations are preventing specialization among banks. And I would argue that, we really need more banks in India. This is not the time to get risk averse and stop doing licenses. And we should really look for players who have better technology, new insights, and who look at the MSME sector as an opportunity and not as a mandate or a target that somehow has to be done. I think that change in posture really produces interesting outcomes. And finally, on equity, I was really intrigued by Mr. Arun's comment, and I think that's a really important one. No easy answers there, however, because if you look at the experience of BSc, NSC, they've all done specific SME listing platforms. So this is equity IPOs only for MSMEs. They have not taken off at all. And I think this just equity is a harder ball game because you only get paid if the company is succeeding, and there is no observability. How do you tell if somebody is succeeding or not? Because there's so much opacity around MSMEs. So I think as and when the formalization, registration, GST, etc., takes off, also our ability to do equity and such instruments, which are so important for the SME, as Mr. Arun pointed out, those things can start taking off. So let me pause there.
I want to ask you a question. Thank you so much, Bindu. This is really exhaustive and very helpful. But there's one area of expertise of yours that I want to pick on a little bit, on microfinance. So we saw that the most 99% of the MSMEs are actually micro enterprises, which basically have 1 or 2 persons working there. And most of them don't take any loans from banks as such. And one avenue that they have for borrowing is microfinance. So group-based and other ways in which microfinance companies lend to them. Do you think this technology of group-based lending will survive this era of social distancing, where 20 women, 25 women come together every week, 5 group in a group, and then multiple groups come together, and there's a disciplining social capital maintenance that happens there, and then recover. Do you think this will survive this year or two of social?
Yeah, great question. I think, it's definitely an existential moment, both for group meetings as well as for cash. I mean, so a lot of lenders are aggressively switching to digital means of collection, mostly because of mobility restrictions. You can't meet staff. But if you look at a lot of rural lenders, etc., they still continue to be very much 80-90% cash driven, certainly true of the organization I'm a part of. So we are being forced very much to go away from group meetings and cash. But that's where you just see that there's so much infrastructure gaps. For example, we recently saw that Aadhaar-enabled payments, for example, they went through the roof in April compared to March because of all of the government payments that were being made. At the same time, the failure rates have gone from about 20% to 50% plus, which means 1 out of 2 transactions are failing, either because of biometric related issues or because of the bank server related failures. So I think it's an existential moment right now. For sure, no group meetings of any kind are happening. And also remember, MFIs never invested in any branch type infrastructure. So, who will collect if there is no contact? I think that's a concern.
So, Mr. Bhardwaj, do you want to ask some questions to the panelists?
Okay, could I ask Bindu a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So, what is the source of the information that 1 out of 2 payments is failing?
So we have done some research in which we looked at 4 financial institutions and looked at their transactions data in April. And we also spoke to NPCI, who acknowledges that this is a problem.
Okay. Is this got to do more with biometrics or the switching and back-end issues with banks?
More the latter. The biometric issues are have always been there and it's steady. But the additional issues are bank systems are not able to cope with all of the additional load.
Yeah, Mr. Bhardwaj.
No, the questions, some of the questions that have already been raised in Q&A corner, I think, should we take them now or we can?
Yes, let's take them. We have.
Okay. Couple of questions to TK Arunji. One was on the question of trades, that large corporate themselves are not interested in joining trades. And secondly, the biggest defaulter of making payments in time is the government itself, which is not part of the trades, which is not, because trades is for the companies only. So your comments on them?
Yeah, government should be a government department that purchases should be necessarily part of trades. There's no reason why it should be exempt. And large companies must be mandated to be part of trades. There's no reason why they can be mandated to file their returns every year, why they cannot be mandated to join a system which makes them pay for the thing they buy from smaller companies. Mandatory. I think they should be mandated.
But they have been mandated, Arunji, that companies having turnover of more than 500 crores will have to mandatorily register themselves. So what they have done is they have registered, but they are not accepting or the invoices of their suppliers. So we are again back to the square one.
Can I?
So
Please go ahead.
Please.
You see, I had a and our recommendation was that there should be a provision of deemed acceptance of the bills. Otherwise, what you see, government companies are also in it. Like for example, Power Grid, BHEL. In fact, they are promoting trades. They are telling their suppliers to get payment, get paid on trades. But surprisingly, private sector does. They are not accepting trades, and the reason is simple. They are maybe some of them are double A rated, or I don't know if they are triple A rated also, but they find it cheaper to keep on enjoying the interest-free credit from the seller. So they don't go on to trades in spite of this mandate of 500 crores. It's not good. So there has to be some deemed acceptance type of situation.
Now, let me ask one more question to Vicky Agarwal ji. There's one question that has there been, or do you consider that there has been a delay in announcing an economic or relief package for MSMEs from Government of India?
Well, I don't know if delay is the right word, because it has been so late, and even now we are hearing that it will come next week. It will come next week, and I don't know, because I have a little different view on this package thing also. You see, somebody here today here also, I think on panel, pointed out, in the US, they first announced a package for 350 billion, and I think just last week or a week before, another 350 billion has been given. And first was consumed, second is also about to be consumed. But I think there's quite a clarity in that package. It's intended for your payroll mainly. So if you use it for payroll, then the amount is forgiven. And if you use only part of it in payroll, then only that part is forgiven. Balance you have to pay in, I think, 6 months at 1% interest rate. And the entire amount is 100% guaranteed by the government. So there is a queue of lenders wanting to lend. So it's seems to be very simple. I don't know. There must be some catch which I am not able to, find out. But I don't know why our government cannot do it, and at least for the workers on the same lines. But mind you, it cannot be loan. It has to be the amount has to be forgiven ultimately, because getting loan to pay salary is not the right way of looking at the problem. You see, in olden times, it is said that when there was a famine, it was the Raja who would provide for poor people. So I'm not Raja. My friend, my colleague is not Raja. It is the government which is Raja. It is the government's duty to provide, living for those who are destitute right now. So, and the companies or the enterprises can be the route. And there can be some monitoring thing. Like in the US, some people have drawn money which was not due to them. So they are being audited and they are refunding, and all those things are being done. So now stimulus, people are also talking of stimulus in MSME. I have I have pointed out to my friends that, look, relief and stimulus have to be differentiated. We want relief at this stage. Stimulus, it is up to the government. If it wants to revive economy, it has to pump in money or do something, A, B, or C. But we will come to stimulus after we stay alive. So first, let us stay alive, and for that, the government should have given this money so that the entrepreneurs are not so upset, and the ultimate beneficiary, intended beneficiaries, the employees are not so in such great trouble.
Sir, one more question to you. One of our friend has picked up on your comment on GDP. That can we think of any other acronym or maybe another framework instead of GDP? And they have proposed. I really don't know. I pardon. I mean, seek your pardon on my ignorance. It's called GNIPC. So gross national.
GNIPC.
Yes.
Right. But we have right now the benefit of Arun sitting here. He is an economist. I noted from an engineering professor's write-up just yesterday that what is produced by companies is added to GDP, and what is consumed by people is added. So if certain amount and it is not produced correspondingly, then GDP is not affected. So in a way, he was trying to say that GDP numbers do not indicate truly the prosperity level of a country, or they do not truly represent the prosperity. So
I don't.
And last question I want to pose to Indu. Hello.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Just a second. Yeah, last question to Binduji. And this is an interesting question. It says that how do you ensure that financing goes to the right people in the SMEs? I presume that the question is that there is a lot of talk that a lot of funds are being given to MSMEs under priority sector lending, and the big numbers are also announced. But how do you ensure that it goes to right people? Perhaps the question is that whether it is reaching to the right people or deserving people. And secondly, is it because of some lobbying in the sector, too much lobbying in the sector? How do you respond to this?
Like I said, I think the identification problem is there in MSME. So there's no clear way. For example, the government can just say that I'm going to do a cash transfer to the following MSMEs, because we simply don't have those records. Only 10% or so of all of the SMEs are registered in some formal way. So the short answer is we don't have a way of guaranteeing any of that. But I think that's where we need intermediaries, why we need banks to have some skin in the game. And I would separate it into two. So the micro, which is practically not distinguishable from household enterprises. They don't employ anybody. It's really the kirana shop that's an extension of the home. I think many of those should be thought of as more in cash transfer mode. Because additional credit, etc., don't feel like the right solution there. But the 1 crore or so GST registered, etc., where we have a little bit more information about past turnover, I would take that sort of nuanced view. And banks have to step up and help identify who are the right. And right in that context may not be the most vulnerable. Right in that context for the bank, maybe who are the ones that are most likely to bounce back. And I think for the economy, that's an important perspective.
Okay, Suyash, please.
Could I just make one observation?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think one way to make large buyers compliant with trade would be for SEBI to direct rating agencies to treat their refusal to pay their suppliers from the MSME sector as a default or intent to default on loans, because they are enjoying cheap credit and not paying them their dues. So there is a default on payment, which is actually a condition for a supplier to move the IBC. Now, of course, they have a high threshold of 1 crore. But
Yes.
the rating agency can very well consider this to be default and lower the rating if they refuse to pay MSMEs their dues by being part of the test platform and refusing to acknowledge legitimate invoices.
So can we see a piece of yours coming in ET
Yes.
on this issue? Thank you.
Yes, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question for Mr. Agarwal. You talked about, said that there is a delay in the government's response and support to MSMEs. But if I were to ask you, what would the ideal support look like? So you referred to maybe supporting with salaries and payroll, but as Bindu said, that not many firms are actually registered, and we don't know which firms has how many employees. Many of the employees are actually just contractual. So how do you design a support package in this context? And as you know, very few of them actually have formal sector loans also. So that's also a very small percentage.
Those who are registered, there is no problem. They may be registered either the ESI, PF, or any other law. There is no problem. They can be enumerated. The rest of them, I think they should be asked to apply to the government or to some local agency. And if the associations of those places were empowered to examine those enterprises applying to them, I think this problem can be taken care of. But then the government will have to think of involving civil society into its working, have trust on them. Because right now the government wants to do everything by itself without consulting the stakeholders at all.
Even associations of SMEs, they could be involved in
this. They know like somebody just now said, how to ensure that the funds reach the right MSME. I think there are countries like Germany where you cannot run an organization unless you are registered with an association. You have choice. But I mean, reasonably strong associations in the country. But that linkage is not there to the extent required. You have to empower them in some way or the other. You keep on monitoring them, keep on checking, and also involve them to put in some stake in some manner. But they can be a very good support system.
So, Mr. Bhardwaj, I would like to now bring this discussion to an end. We are almost out of time. If you have some final comments, please make. Otherwise, I would like to thank all the speakers and the participants for coming, for joining us today. Thank you so much. And this video will be uploaded on YouTube shortly. And if you've missed parts of it, you can go and watch it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.